Welcome to today's 5 Good Minutes on Thanksgiving with Bryce Vaught.
I don't think I'm saying anything too profound when I say that we live in a very individualized society. One example of this is what's known as name, image, and likeness. We've seen this in recent years. I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with this, but we now see that college athletes can benefit financially from their name, image, and likeness. In other words, students, athletes that are making a name for themselves can use that name to make money for companies. They can promote different brands, and they try to build their own brands and benefit from that. And that has led to a lot of students, as they're trying to decide what school to go to for their college career, one thing they're considering is what's going to benefit me the most. And sure, that's an important thing to consider. But ultimately, what we've seen, even that individualization kind of creep into how Christians live out their faith. There's a lot of times where we live out our faith with little concern of what other people are doing, and we're only concerned with how we're living. Where you look at the New Testament church, their identity was not so much in themselves as individuals, but it was very much connected with the community that they belonged to. And for the New Testament believer, it's not so much, we shouldn't be as concerned with, am I pleasing God? But we should be also concerned with, are we as God's people pleasing God? Are we honoring Him? That do we as a community please God in our activity? One thing that we as a community, as a church, can do to honor God and to please God is to be thankful and express gratitude to one another. And I say this because in Ephesians chapter 5, it's the verse that we're looking at this week. The Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus, and in verse 19, he instructs the church to address one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. In verse 20, he says, giving thanks always and for everything. And then in verse 21, he says, submit to one another. And so it's a corporate command, and then a command to give thanksgiving, and then another corporate command. And I think this is interesting, and it's important to highlight because I think a lot of times we consider the discipline of thanksgiving as being more of a personal or private discipline, that it's something that we just do in our hearts, and really it's just something that we express to God alone. But being thankful is not just a private discipline. It should really be a public discipline. That expressing thanks really makes the most impact when we express thanks in the midst of community. When we tell others what God has done in our life, what we're grateful for. I would encourage you this week as we go through the week of Thanksgiving that don't just be thankful privately in your personal time, but be intentional about sharing with someone else what you're thankful for in this season of life. What you're thankful for about what God has done in your life. And I think this is a really important discipline because, one, as we, as people of God, express thanksgiving, it's a testimony to what God has done in our life. It actually makes our witness credible. In another passage in Philippians, the Apostle Paul, he instructs the church there. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. In other words, we as people of God, our call is to testify, to tell of God's goodness to others. And it would be hard to convince someone else, an unbeliever, of God's goodness if all we do is complain. It'd be hard to believe that God is really good if all we do is hear someone complain about life. It's important to focus on what God has done that's right, that's good, that's a blessing in our life, because that gives evidence that even though this life is difficult and full of suffering, God is good in all seasons. In all things, we can trust Him. And so I want to encourage you again that this week, as you gather together with family, that you wouldn't keep God's goodness to yourself, that you would make a discipline of being thankful, not just privately, but publicly, whether that's at a dinner table with your family, whether maybe you're gathering with the church, that you would find a time to express gratitude for what God has done in your life and the goodness that he's shown you. And in this way, we can shine as true lights in the world that God has called us to live in. And so we thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.